Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us at the Microsoft Power BI UK user group. I'm your host, Leon Gordon, and as always, we're back with another riveting session to come together as a community and learn more about Power BI. Hopefully, you're all enjoying the end of April weather that we're coming towards at the moment, going into some hopefully some sunshine as well. Obviously, that's in the UK. Let us know where you're dialing in from and what you're looking to get out of this session as well would be fantastic. We're going to open up the Q&A in a moment as well, so please do throughout today's session ask any questions that you may have throughout the Q&A. And without any further ado, I'll just give a brief introduction to both our session and our speaker before handing over. So in today's session, we're going to look at how to not drown improving data literacy in your organization with Kurt Buhler. Now, Kurt is a data visualization consultant and Power BI expert from Ordina, Belgium. Kurt discovered his passion for working with and analyzing data during his doctoral research in biomedical sciences. He's a lover of cats, and he joins me in loving tabletop role-playing games also, and he's also a lover of all things Power BI and data related. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Kurt for his session.
Great. Thank you very much, Leon, for that introduction and, of course, for the opportunity to be able to present. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy day and evening to attend this session. I hope you find it interesting and I hope you find it valuable. So at the end, we'll take questions preferentially, but feel free throughout the session if there's anything that piques your interest or triggers you to go ahead and drop that into the Q&A section and we can address it where necessary. So today, as you see, I'm going to be talking about a topic that I actually really like and that I find extremely important, especially nowadays, and not only in business, but in society as general, and that is data literacy. Data literacy is something that is becoming more and more important, like I said, not only in business, but also just in our everyday lives. So it's essential that we have a good understanding on what it is, how it's important, the impact it has, but more importantly, of course, what we can do to improve it. You might notice that this presentation has some interesting figures. That is because I tend to have a lot of illustrations to supplement the story, to help you remember things, to help illustrate concepts, especially more nuanced concepts. So please enjoy that as you like. So we're all trying to get somewhere, right? That's why we work with data. That's why we build data solutions. We're trying to get to this coveted place known as Insight Island. It's the place where data becomes value, where solutions drive action, and where our business is really data-driven. But in order to get to Insight Island, we have to make a perilous journey, crossing a landscape that's full of all kinds of monsters, Adventure 2, but a lot of monsters. In order to get to Insight Island, we need solutions. We build these data solutions to help ferry us safely across those dangerous, uncharted waters that is our organization's data. But when it comes to our solutions, it doesn't matter at the end of the day if our solutions follow visual best practices, if they're protected and performant, if they're predictive and powerful. Because if users don't understand it or the data behind it, they won't use it. It will take them nowhere. Users will jump ship and swim. But they risk being left behind. More importantly, as the sea of data churns, they might drown. To stay afloat, what we need is data literacy. In business and society today, data literacy is essential. But what is data literacy? And more importantly, how do we improve it? That is going to be the subject of today's talk. It's a very loaded subject that has a lot of nuances to consider. We're first going to examine what data literacy is and the impact it has in an organization. We're first going to define data literacy in the simplest terms as our ability to read, interpret, and use data in a decision-making context. We'll then place this into the context of a specific business case in order to understand that the real business impact that data literacy can have. This business case will be a deep dive into a sales compensation plan project. If you don't know what a sales compensation plan is, I'll tell you all about it. but it's basically a bonus program for sales teams to incentivize actions that align with their company's strategy. But more on that later. We're then going to dive into a very deep and heavy topic, which is how data literacy challenges arise. And this is where things get complicated. This is where things get nuanced, because we'll learn that data literacy challenges are not so much about tools, but more about people. And we all know that people are very different. We're different in our educational background, the way that we engage with data, both in our personal and professional lives, and how we use data to make decisions. Ultimately, what it boils down to is that in recent years, already for some time, the data skills that are required for someone to succeed in their role has been increasing exponentially. And in many organizations, this has been outpacing the average increase of data skills in the average person in the organization. And what many feel this is creating is a data literacy gap, a gap between the skills that are needed to succeed versus the skills that a particular individual actually has. This is a problem not only for our business's efficiency, but more importantly, because the people who lack those data skills are left out of important conversations where they need to participate. So this is obviously a big problem. And the next thing we should be thinking about is, how do we bridge that gap? What can we do to improve data literacy? And unfortunately, I have some bad news to deliver. That's not an easy thing to do. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, because it is a complex and nuanced subject. But that doesn't mean it's not actionable, and that doesn't mean that we can't do things to improve it. Specifically, when it comes to designing reports, we have a lot of power to drive designs that really help people be able to use the data, but more importantly, to grow their data skills and understanding of the data that we're using in our reports. Examples of this that I'll talk about are making the appropriate choice when we select charts or visualizations for our reports, so that users can really read and understand the data. We use the right chart for the right analysis and avoid gut decision making. It's important that these charts have transparent analyses behind them. That means being clear about how KPIs are calculated, what data is used, but really showing the receipts of that, allowing the users to dive into the data points that are behind the aggregate charts that we're showing them. This will build trust in the data that we're using, but it also helps people really understand how that data is rolled up to the visualizations that we're showing. Finally, we'll summarize in how investing in data literacy is a valuable investment with a return versus the opposite, which is relying on data heroes to move our organization forward. But more on that, specifically data heroism, at the end of the talk. First, a little bit about myself. I am originally from Canada, but I am now based in Belgium. I work for Ordina Belgium, as you heard, as a data visualization consultant, and I really like working with data. I do it not only in my professional life, but also in a lot of my hobbies like inline skating, inline hockey, and as you can tell from the sheer amount of goblins in this presentation, tabletop role-playing games. This last part might not seem so relevant, but it is, because today we're going to do some role-playing. Specifically, we are going to learn about our business. We're all a part of the same business. Congratulations. It's not just a business, it's the business. Our business is really well known. We're basically the Amazon of our land, because we sell and we ship adventuring equipment, swords, shields, all these kind of standard supplies that we need for modern living. We sell and ship these to customers, but also to other businesses who can resell them. We're basically a household name. And what our household name is, it's Dumbledope's Equipment Adventuring Deliveries Incorporated, but that's better known by our moniker, DEAD. So our business has been growing a lot in the last few years. We've experienced a lot of success, but our market has been rather turbulent, particularly given the economic context of the last few years. Our cost structures have been really unpredictable, and it's very hard for us to get a grip on what's happening in our organization, never mind to be able to anticipate what might happen in the future. In order to understand what's going on, what we need are some good, effective, actionable reports. Reports that will tell us what's happening in our organization, but help us be able to make decisions to get us to where we want to go. And where we want to go is we want to sell more products to more customers in a more effective way. Thankfully, we've already taken some steps to get there. Thanks to Klonk, our resident BI engineer, we've managed to put together our first centralized Power BI reports. These reports give us a clear picture on our sales organization, but it was a pretty big adventure in order to get there. Klonk had to fight a lot of monsters with his team, things like performance woes, things like bad practice, things like governance challenges. But one of the biggest challenges was really being able to translate those user requirements into a good report design. What Klonk and the other BI team members learned is that talking to users, engaging with the users on their level, and designing the reports collaboratively was the most effective way for them to make designs and reports that were really going to be used. But that was the next challenge in our organization, this use, continuously engaging with the user community and monitoring what's happening inside of our Power BI ecosystem. This brought about one of our biggest challenges so far, and it related to adoption. Adoption was our biggest threat because we really struggled to get people to consistently use this single truth. But thanks to efforts that we took to continuously engage with our user community through regular touch points, things like data cafes where users can come and ask questions, as well as monitoring tools that we built to make it easier for us to see what's happening and what's being used in our Power BI ecosystem, we're managing to stave off this very dangerous threat. And we see that every week, more and more people in the sales community are coming to our reports to get their data and make their decisions. So we are ready for the next step. And that next step is self-service for data-driven business initiatives. We've managed to produce some very valuable tools and insights for the business to use, and the business wants to use them. That's where our story begins, with the first of these business-led data projects, our sales compensation plan. For those of you who don't know what a sales compensation plan is, like I said, it's basically a bonus program for sales teams, and it can be very, very powerful in a sales organization. The reason is because it incentivizes sales actions of our sales team that align with our company's strategy, helping us reach our goals. It does that by designing targets or giving targets to our salespeople, such as more revenue or higher prices, in specific focus areas where we want to grow, areas where we have a higher margin, or areas where we want to move our business for other strategic reasons. So what happens is if the salespeople manage to achieve these targets, if the plan is designed well, they not only win their bonus, so they're happy, but they've helped us take the right actions to get us closer to where we want to go. It's a win-win situation. So this can be really transformative for our organization. We want to do this. We want to set up a good sales compensation plan so that we can really drive in specific directions where we're trying to get to with our sales teams. But how do we do that? Where do we start? How do we make a successful plan? As you might anticipate, the answer often starts with the right data. And this is exactly what our sales executives started saying. Looking at some of these Power BI reports, which are transforming the way we work with data in our organization and the way that we think and make decisions, they said, hey, let's start. Let's put together a sales compensation plan. What do we need for that plan? Well, the first thing we need is a design. We need to choose which targets we want to have and which areas we want to focus on. Do we want to focus on revenue, on price, on other things? And how do we make those targets? How do we choose the right target? How do we make sure that those targets are both fair so that people are incentivized, they can actually reach their target, but at the same time that not the entire sales organization achieves their target, because that's bad for us. We lose a lot of money, and it's bad for them because it kind of defeats the point. Instead, we want to design good targets in an effective way to estimate next year, and we want to map these targets to the different salespeople, to group them by the accounts, but also to give them a tool that they can use to follow up on their progress, to see how they're achieving versus their target throughout the year. This will help them stay motivated so that they can really see that they're achieving their goals and that they're getting closer to their bonus. So what do we need from the data in order to do these things? Well, for our sales plan design, what we need are some good analyses. We need to do an analysis versus what has happened with our historical data. And we also need to do some forward-facing analyses, some predictive analytics, in order to help us design our fair targets in an objective way. We also need to take all this information and we need to take this and map this to the different salespeople using our master data and load this into a Power BI report, which will help show them in an automated way how they're achieving their targets throughout the year. So this is the plan. This is what we want to do. Unfortunately, however, the BI team is really too backlogged to be able to support another business project. There's a lot of BI transformations happening in our organization and some pretty big migrations. So they're willing to load this data into the model and to set things up, but they're not willing to help with the rest of the project. It's going to have to take a business analysis to carry the first part of this project forward. Thankfully, however, there is one such business analysis who's willing to step up to the plate, and they are known as Stonk. They are a bit of a data hero in the marketing and HR departments because they already work a lot with the market data. We need this market data in order to do some of our predictive analytics, but the benefit is that they are also familiar with our actuals. They use Analyze in Excel to do ad hoc analyses and exploration of the sales data on a regular basis. So they're familiar with that data and how to mash it up with other data in order to do the analyses that we want. They usually do these kind of analyses in Python. So they're planning on doing this also for these specific analyses to carry the project forward. So great. However, we very quickly realized that we maybe underestimated the amount of work that this was. Very quickly, Stonk becomes very overwhelmed with the things that are being asked by the executives and the amount of work and data handling that is required for these analyses. The timelines very quickly become short and aggressive, and Stonk finds that they're having to cut corners in order to be able to deliver results to our executives so that they can make the right decisions for our plan before the start of the next year. But they do manage to pull it off. They put together some of these preliminary analyses, and our executives are really happy with some of the things they're seeing, and they're making some decisions, so our plan is starting to take shape. Let's take a look at some examples of these analyses and the interpretations that were made from them by the project team. One of the first questions that was posed was whether prices should be a secondary target. Our business has really struggled with having a good pricing strategy, and we want to really move in a better direction when it comes to the prices of specific products. So they think that this should be incorporated in the plan, but they're not sure where they should do it and how they should do it. So the first analysis that Stonk was tasked with was an analysis to compare how our prices have changed. A simple year-over-year analysis to see have our prices increased, have they decreased, and how does this look for our different customers. The first result that Stonk shows is this, a violin plot, but it's very quickly rejected. The executives and the project team say, no, this is too complex. They instead ask for a simple chart, and this is the response that they get. Stonk provides a slope chart, but this is also very quickly rejected. They notice that the axis starts at 90, and it's quite misleading. It's a lot steeper than it was in reality, and it makes it seem like our prices dropped a lot, when that's actually not the case. They say, produce a normal chart, just a bar chart. That's exactly what Stonk does. They produce a bar chart. They don't really like this either because they say it's not very effective. Just show the delta, show the difference between this year and last year. Let's just see how it's changed in percent. So this is actually the final result. How our prices have changed is, for our potions and scrolls, it's decreased by about 4.7%. This is, for them, the most effective way at looking at the data. They ask Stonk to repeat this analysis for all of the different product groupings and all the different customers so that they can start to figure out what kind of segmentation they want to do. The next thing we need to do, and the next analysis that Stonk has to pull off, is some forecasting. We need to try to anticipate what our revenue will be next year based off of our historical data, as well as some market data, which we have recently acquired. Remember, Stonk is quite proficient with this market data, and they also know our actuals pretty well. So mashing this up shouldn't be too big of a problem. However, this is the first time that Stonk is doing predictive analytics, but thankfully they did find a package that makes this pretty easy. So they go through some pains and challenges, but eventually they manage to produce a result. They share this with the project team, quite happy that it worked, and explain that the prediction is here at the red line and the historical actuals are the gray line. This is just a preliminary results, but the project team says, okay, this is a bit conservative, but it makes sense given with what we know about the market right now. They decide to use this as a starting point after they are going to add some manual adjustments, things that we know are already going to happen next year based on the contracts we have with our customers today. So they task Stonk with repeating this analysis for each of the accounts and then sending it to the project team in Excel so that they can make some modifications and come up with the final target for each customer and send this back to Stonk, who needs to combine all these files together. So what do we got? Well, we have two targets. One is revenue, and we're going to focus on key customers. And the second one is our price. We want it to increase on average by 5% in a few areas where we want to achieve growth. Second, we have done some predictive analytics in order to derive our revenue targets. We feel like these targets are fair, we feel like they make sense, and we've done some manual adjustments on top of them, so we're ready to go. The next thing we have to do, however, is we have to map all of this information to our salespeople. We need to put together some master data in order to be able to map all of these actuals, all of these targets, to the salespeople and the customers that they maintain. So how this works is we have a number of customers, a number of customer accounts, and a salesperson is responsible for one or more customers. Each of these customers are then grouped up into a specific key customer grouping. So salesperson 1, 2, and 3 are all on the same team. They maintain that key customer group of those 4 accounts. And that's the level where we set our target. We have an aggregated target for our first year, for our first plan, because this is the first time we're doing this and we want the salespeople to work together in order to achieve this. So they managed to make the master data, they group it by the customer accounts, and they put together all of the targets per salesperson into separate Excel files, which they get distributed by HR at the beginning of the year. So each salesperson has their target, their bonus, which is telling them what they need to achieve in order to get their bonus by the end of the year. In order to track their targets, there's a Power BI report that is made that shows how they're achieving against that target in percentage throughout the year, so that they can really see what the actuals are, what their target is, and what percentage that equates to. So that's our plan. We have our targets set. We've managed to create them based on some predictive analytics, and we have also distributed these targets to the different salespeople so they know what they have to achieve, and given them the opportunity to follow up and track these in Power BI. We really feel like we are ready to embark this sales compensation plan. We think that this is going to be another tool which is going to get us closer to that coveted insight island. But what we don't realize is that there is a darkness looming in the background behind us. Data literacy haunts us, but we don't know it yet. But we soon realize it, as it's a rocky start, to say the least. The first payout period is nothing short of a disaster. There are extreme discrepancies between what people are calculating themselves using their Excel files and exports of the data and what they see in Power BI. This very quickly becomes a very inflammatory discussion where a lot of people are getting upset because there are a lot of unexpected results. Some people have massive bonuses that no one in the project team expected, and some people get nothing, when the whole idea of the plan was to help people work together in teams so that everybody achieves the first payout period, and it's a nice little motivational kick out the door. Instead, what's happening is that a lot of the salespeople are spending more time analyzing their bonus and working with that data at the end of the payout period than taking sales actions with their customers. In fact, what's happening is that this has damaged the credibility of our sales leadership and hurt the motivation of the sales teams, the exact opposite result that we set out to achieve in the first place. How could this have gone so wrong? The result is, of course, that the plan failed. But why? What happened? That's exactly what our sales leadership team is asking for, a root cause analysis. They pull in the BI team with extreme urgency and sit them down together with Stonk and ask them to figure out what exactly went wrong. Is the data in Power BI incorrect? Did the team that provide us with the market data, is that data incorrect? Are the analyses wrong? Is our master data incorrect? What exactly went wrong to create this monster, which is this plan where everything is so wrong? And after a bit of digging, a bit of discussing, and a bit of thinking, the BI team decides to present the results. There was a lot that went wrong with this project, but they decided to really just focus on the data aspects. They focused on the original analysis. That's where a lot of these things kind of started. What could have been done better? One of the things that they concluded is a lot of the interpretations were really a wrong interpretation of the data because they were looking at an inappropriate chart to try to make conclusions that actually didn't tell the full story. There were improper charts that were selected for the analysis. If we recall, one of the questions that was asked was whether prices should be a part of the target. Stonk needed to do this, needed to do an analysis versus prior year, and the first thing they showed was this violin plot. It was rejected because it was complex. The slope chart was rejected too because it was misleading. This next bar chart, rejected because it's inefficient. The final chart that was selected was this one, as it was the most effective in conveying the information in the most easy way. That's true. If we look at this information, we have all the information implicitly in order to understand what this chart is saying to us. Potions of Scrolls have decreased in price by about 4.7% versus last year. The reality is, however, that the other charts have an increasing explicit learning requirement, something which wasn't acknowledged or addressed by Stonk when they shared those results with the project team. They just threw a graph at them, didn't offer any explanation, any kind of training, any kind of context. So of course, without that explicit knowledge, they aren't able to draw many conclusions from it. If we examine this a little bit more deeply, this change in the average selling price, or ASP, this chart, this bar chart, how much of the information do we need is implicitly learned versus explicitly learned, and what do we mean by that? Well, what we need to know is we need to know that the bar represents the length and that is the difference in price. The color is just an element that makes it easier for us to see whether it's up or down, so conditional formatting. So there's no explicit learning that's required for us to be able to draw an interpretation of this chart. We already know these things. It's innate to our ability to visually interpret this information. We compare that to the violin plot, that is a fundamentally different story. There's a lot to break down here, so let's go ahead and do it. The first thing that we see is that the color differentiates the year. On the left, we have 2019, and on the right, we have 2020. We already know that. That's something implicit. As well as the proximity. We can see that both left and right have different elements which are up or down, and that we can see that one is higher or lower than the other. But we don't know what those actually mean. We don't know what the dotted or dashed lines are, nor the shapes, but we do know that they are different. And this shape is one of the most distinguishing features of this particular chart type. We see that the shape of the data is also very different. On 2019, we see that the number of customers with a specific price have been grouping together in one big group, whereas in 2020, we see two groups forming. It's the distribution of our prices across our customers, which seems to be forming two distinct groups. But we wouldn't know that unless someone told us. Also, this symmetry, being able to really see that difference in price variance to do that comparison, is also something that we can't implicitly be able to deduce. And the relative size of these shapes. This shows us the probability of a data point in that given area. So in 2020, there's a higher probability of a customer with a price of 75% lower than the year before. versus in 2019, where everything seems to be grouping very similar together. It is indeed the most complicated chart. It can definitely be visually improved, but it is a good choice for this analysis, and we'll dive into why. We'll try to break this down in a more pragmatic way. What does it say, and what does it mean? If we look at this violin plot, let's try to examine each part, what it is, what it says, and what it means. When we're dealing with advanced chart types, it helps to be able to break it down in these ways so that we can be able to explain that also to our users. The first part is all about reading the chart, and the second is all about interpretation. So the first thing we see is the length of the violin from top to bottom. That is the range of our data points, our minimum and maximum. And it basically tells us between which price range we sell. We also have some areas in our violin plot, some dotted lines which break up our data into sections. Everything above the first dotted line is our third quartile. Everything below the bottom dotted line is our first quartile. And what that says is the top 25% of data points and the bottom 25% of data points. This tells us how typical high prices are and how typical low prices are. And we can compare this across the years. We can see that low prices are much more typical in 2020 than they were in 2019, since the size of that violin is bigger. We also see the dotted line, or the dashed line rather, which is our median. This breaks our data into two different points. It's a measure of central tendency, and it tells us what our typical price is. And we can also compare this from the left to the right. But what really makes the violin chart unique and why it's so valuable in this analysis is this shape. This is the kernel density estimation, but you can think of it like a smooth histogram on its side. It's showing the distribution of the data points, the probability density. And what this means is how probable are prices in each range. We see that we have a lot more customers that have a lower price in 2020 than in 2019, but more importantly, that our customers seem to be splitting up into two groups. We seem to be having a segmentation occurring. So let's put that into the context. What does this mean to us, to our business, to our project, the sales compensation plan? Why is this relevant? Well, if we look at this violin plot and we look at the two different humps, we think that these are forming two different groups, and we can actually test that by doing some clustering analysis. We see that this is actually confirmed, that our customers are grouped into two distinct groups. One group of customers where the average price has increased, and another group of customers where the price has decreased. Why this is relevant is that our customers are clustering by price. So when we're talking about price, we should treat our customers differently. In our plan, what this means is that it's very hard for the salespeople who are dealing with customers in group one to achieve their targets. Remember, these customers already experienced a price increase. If then the salespeople are motivated or incentivized to try to push these customers to increase prices again, it's going to be a pretty hard ask. Whereas in group two, their prices decreased by about 25%. So if they have to increase it by 5%, it's going to be a lot easier for them to just backpedal last year a little bit and then achieve their targets. This isn't very fair, but of course there was no way for the project team to know this, and it explains some of the results that they're seeing in the first payout period. So what can we learn from this? Well, of course, we need to recognize that advanced data concepts can bring business value, but we're not going to throw them onto an executive summary, for example. A violin plot isn't something that we would put on every single report or dashboard. But for an analysis like this, where the distribution of the data has a consequence, it is very valuable. We need to try to find the right chart for the analysis and balance that with the right chart for our users. And we need to be mindful of how and when to introduce a new chart type. Even though Stonk was correct in selecting the violin plot as the first chart, they just threw it out without any explanation, any context. that explicit knowledge was not transferred. So of course, they couldn't read it, couldn't interpret it, and it wasn't effective. It had no value then. We need to try to use visual aids, a frequently asked questions, some kind of way of transferring that explicit information so that people have an easier time of interpreting and avoiding the gut feeling when they look at these charts. This is a really important thing, especially when it comes to accessibility. So the first thing we learned is that we could make better choices for our charts. The second thing is that they saw that there was a pretty big overinterpretation of some of the analyses, particularly the analysis on the predictive analytics. So if we recall, we had a revenue target, but we have to set a revenue target for a period that hasn't happened yet. So how do we do that? We can't just put plus 5% on everything. We need to take into account the context. Our sales leadership team, they knew that, so they asked Stonk to do this predictive analytics exercise to try to forecast the next year using both our historical data as well as market data, which should produce some results that are more reliable than if we just make a gross adjustment to our figures. If you recall, the first figure that Stonk showed was this one, where the line was shown in red, the prediction, and the historical data in gray. Problem is, if I asked you, how do you assess whether this forecast is any good? You can't. That information is not available. It's not possible to make that interpretation from this specific chart. And the reason why that happened is that, remember, Stonk was under a lot of pressure to return results. They had never done this kind of analysis before, and they were really struggling to meet that deadline. They knew that the project team was struggling to already read the charts that they were sharing on a regular basis. And when they finally got this algorithm to work and got all the results from it, they decided, okay, they're only asking me for this prediction. All these other numbers, they won't understand it anyway. So I'm just going to plot the prediction and I'm going to share it with them because that's what they want. That turned out to be the wrong decision, because what Stonk should have done was to be able to show this, the uncertainty interval or the confidence interval. This is what we see with an 80% confidence interval. And what this basically shows is what we might expect the real values to fall in, given the assumptions that are being made in the analysis, namely that the historical data and the future data are following similar patterns. It's very common for us to try to improve that, however, because in this case, we are making predictions for our sales compensation plan. We want to be very confident about what those results are. So maybe we want to be a bit more stringent in our parameters. Maybe we set that confidence interval to instead be at 95%. What would that look like? And we see that actually it's pretty big. In fact, that by the time we get to December, which is more than 12 months out from when we're doing this analysis, it's variable by about 240 million or 35%. So in fact, this prediction is a lot less reliable than the project team actually thought. Something that is important for us to remember is that the confidence interval is not often disclosed on the chart, and this is a bad practice. If I were to show you this chart in light of that previous context, you would be forgiven for assuming that this looks like a fairly tight prediction. Maybe the data is really tight. There's not a lot of variation. But in fact, this is just showing the 40% confidence interval. It's artificially manipulating these parameters to make the data, the prediction, look better than it actually would be. A lower confidence interval does not make the forecast better. It just shows a false confidence in the information. It's a manipulation of the data. It hides the real uncertainty. Instead, what happened is when this was explained to the project team, they realized that the market predictions were a lot less certain than we actually thought. So what can we learn from this exercise? It's important for us to be transparent with both logic and analyses. We need to make sure that we give enough information so that a user can critically appraise the analysis. And we are also obliged to speak up when we're discussing data and we know that the presentation or interpretation of that data is incorrect. We need to also ourselves avoid the temptation to extrapolate and overinterpret our own findings, no matter how exciting or controversial they might seem. So, improper chart choice, over interpretation, two big elements which we're explaining already why some of the results were so different from what we actually expected the first time. But one of the things that was more complicated was the confusion about the master data. Why was it so messy? Why was there so much confusion in the sales community about what was happening with the master data and why it was different? Why were the numbers wrong in Power BI? Well, if you recall, our master data structure is through our customer accounts, and each salesperson is mapped to a specific customer account. These accounts are grouped up to key customers, and this is the level where we set our target. All of the salespeople at the beginning of the year received an Excel file that said what their target was based on the grouping of customers, and they have a Power BI file that's connected to the live master data so that they can follow up on the progress throughout the year. So what was actually happening was a lack of parity between these two sources. And if we try to explain that in a bit of a more pragmatic way, let's look at the perspective from one of these salespeople. What did he see? Well, this is the key account manager for Nights, common customer account that we are very familiar with. And the target that he had was 56.5 million. This is really the number that he had literally painted above his bed at night, 56.5 million. This is his target. This is what he needed to achieve. If he did that, he would get this wonderful bonus. What happened, however, is that he, at the beginning of the quarter, was only responsible for 4 of the 15 accounts in Nights. What happened is that Nights actually acquired another legal entity, which he's not responsible for. He didn't see this. But remember, the targets are defined at the key account level. So Nights grew by 1 account, and another one of our key customers shrunk by 1 account because one of its legal entities was acquired through Nights. We have a target for that customer, so the result was that the target moved from one group to another. The master data changed. That's all that happened. But the consequence was that the target for Nights changed from 56.5 to 60 million. It increased by 3.5 million because of something that happened with our customer, because of something that happened with our master data. But of course, our salesperson's Excel file doesn't know this, and they had no visibility on this happening either. When they're looking at the report, all they see is that their file and the target that they know and they were given at the beginning of the year, 56.5 million, is different from Power BI. So Power BI is wrong. This is something that is definitely unfair to the salesperson. It has caused so many conflicts in this process, and they can't explain or understand why these numbers are wrong. To them, the data is just wrong in Power BI because, of course, they don't understand the concept of our master data mapping changing. They also don't have visibility on that in the Power BI report. So what can we do about this? Well, one thing we can do is to try to create views and solutions to allow people to see the receipts, to dive into not only details from an analytical point of view, but also just from a descriptive point of view. Drill downs and drill through pages to see mappings and calculations so that they can see the receipts of the data that we're putting together in our report. For example, if we're showing our key account figures, he can right-click and drill through to see all the customers, all the customer mappings that are behind this key account grouping. We can give a flexible visual like the decomposition tree and the full customer master data so that we have full transparency on how those customers are mapped and the ability for them to slice and dice that data so that they can understand how it breaks down. We can also use tooltips to be able to define what the calculations are that we're showing in the report. A good practice might be on a card that we're using where we don't have any interactions. We can put a tooltip to show, for example, how it's calculated. If we have something like delivered revenue, maybe that's obvious to some users, maybe it's not obvious to others. We can just show all the numbers that are behind that KPI so that they can see how it rolls up to the final number that they're seeing in the card. It gives transparency, it helps increase understanding, and it shows the full process end to end when it comes to that calculation. So these drill downs and drill through pages to see mappings and calculations can be very valuable. The tooltips on cards can also increase transparency to show what's behind the numbers. This is particularly useful if we've created a new metric for a new project, or if there's a metric where there's a lot of contention in the user community, where people don't agree. We can set up data alerts for this project, for example, on how things are changing, so that, for example, if there's ever a change in our master data in how things are grouped, what those aggregate numbers are, that we get notified, or even that we set up flows so that we notify the account managers for those specific accounts, so that we're sure that they have visibility on when that changes, because we know it affects their bonus. Better yet, we can set up a process to freeze that data to make sure it doesn't impact their bonus. But the project team didn't even understand that this could be a problem because they didn't know it could be an issue. So, of course, it wasn't taken into account in the design. What could be done better? We could make better choices for the charts that we're using, avoid overinterpretation, and to make sure that we have more transparency when it comes to not only calculations, but also how things are mapped in our solution. So, was the data incorrect? Did we have data quality issues? Not really. The data was correct, but how we used it and interpreted it was not. At the end of the day, there were some finite and concentrated problems with data literacy that cascaded and caused issues with the rest of the project. But what is data literacy? Well, a simple definition is our ability to, as I said, read, interpret, and use data in a decision-making context. However, a more realistic definition of data literacy is that it's much more nuanced than that. If we look between the lines, data literacy intersects with a lot of other equally complicated concepts. Things like mathematical and statistical literacy to understand how those numbers are calculated and rolling up and what they're looking at. Digital and technological literacy, because that's the tools that we're using to engage with this data. Visual and information literacy, because more and more often we're seeing charts and visualizations instead of tables. And perhaps most importantly, critical and analytical thinking skills, to think beyond the surface truth of what we're being shown and to think about the context of what's behind it. Of course, there are many more things, but what's important to remember is that all of this sits on top of a very rich and diverse cultural and interpersonal context. How a person in one group thinks and sees and interprets information, especially visually, versus someone in another group is completely different. Data literacy is a complex and nuanced topic. It's about people and not solutions, not tools, not technologies, and it's just one piece of the puzzle. If we take a step back and look at the wider picture, data literacy intersects with pretty much every other major concept that's happening in our organization. Things like organizational change management, or OCM, and business process complexity. These are intimately connected to our organization's ability to use data effectively and to have data literacy skills. So if we have a problem with data literacy, it's affecting many things in our business. But the takeaway message here is that data literacy is nuanced, but that doesn't mean that we can't do anything about it, because data literacy has a big impact on our organization. It warrants our attention. More importantly, it warrants action. But what kinds of action? Well, in order to understand that, we need to take a small step backward and reflect inward, to try to ask the difficult question about where data literacy challenges come from. How does this arise? Well, there's many additive factors and it's people dependent. If we look at the relative data literacy required for each of the people in our story to achieve success in their own role, we see that we come to different figures depending on the context. Each of these people have different education and training backgrounds. They have different exposures to data, both in their personal and professional lives, and they're active in digital spaces in different amounts. They have differing levels of critical thinking based on their education and their experiences, and I could go on the various different elements which are eventually leading to their final data literacy level. which may or may not be enough for them to achieve optimal success in their own role. Basically, what this boils down to is that over time, the average data skills needed for someone to succeed in their role has been increasing dramatically. Data is ubiquitous in our lives, but the knowledge to read, interpret, and use it is not. And many fear that this is creating what is known as the hypothesized data literacy gap. As I mentioned earlier, this is a problem because it creates unsustainability, not just inefficiency, and it cuts people out of conversations that they need to be a part of. But what happens as a result of this is it creates dependence, where there's a dependence from the people who don't have these data skills on the people who do. Heroes aren't born, they're created. Data heroes from this data literacy disparity. And this is something that our BI team, as well as Stonk, really started to see when they were looking at how we were working with the data, that there was a dependence on a few data heroes. When they were asking about what was going on in the project, they saw that the only person who could really explain the whole thing, the sales compensation plan end to end, was Stonk. Most people couldn't understand which analyses were being done and why, what it meant, why certain decisions were being made. They just depended and relied on the analyses that were coming from Stonk because they trusted Stonk. They were the hero. The hallmarks of a data hero are quite typical. In this case, for Stonk, they were under aggressive deadlines, working over capacity, and really had to push to get a working version delivered on time. When they did deliver that version, they were perceived as a hero. The result is that business trusted them rather than critiquing or trying to understand the data or the process. This resulted in Stonk being a bottleneck for future support, questions, and issues. When the salespeople had questions about how their sales compensation plan worked and why they had the result that they did, no one could explain it in the project team except for Stonk. So it took 2 or 3 weeks for the salespeople to get a simple answer about their plan, which led to even more frustration. Upon self-reflection, the BI team realized that this is something that was really starting to deeply embed itself into our data culture. That already since the beginning, we've kind of been working this way, where there's a select few group of people who are really going beyond the norm to deliver these data solutions, to be the data heroes, and not investing much time in trying to elevate the data skills of the other people in the organization. It's not a very sustainable situation, so they decided to have a conversation about it. They decided to put this all together and construct a data literacy campaign. What this looks like is it has some key objectives. It's executive sponsored, first and most importantly, to elevate the data skills of everybody in our organization. We want to promote curiosity in data as well as solution-oriented critical thinking. We want to try to identify and disengage from situations where there's a dependency on data heroes in order to create more sustainable ways of working with information. We wanted to prioritize these data skills. Examples of things we did in order to do that is tracking data literacy as a KPI in the organization so that we could benchmark across teams and organizations. This isn't something that was used to evaluate people, but rather as a basis to help them improve for professional development programs. And as data professionals, we too can make a difference. Because if you see someone drowning, you don't shout, "Learn to swim." Instead, try to pull up beside them, pull them aboard, and set sail for Inside Island together. Because consistent little actions can have a big impact. That is especially true for these bigger, more nuanced problems. It's not about defining one tell-all solution, it's about the consistent little actions. So this is exactly what we started to observe when we took these actions. Things like having open sessions where people could attend and ask questions, things like this, about the data or the reports, trainings which were formally organized, a graph of the day even shown on the homepage of the Power BI apps, which showed different ways of the data being displayed, new chart types, or even fun things like graphs about the weather or some comic about data. This consistent actions really had a big impact, and they really saw over time that people were becoming more effective at using information. So to summarize, data literacy, it has a big impact on our organization, but we can have a big impact on improving data literacy as well. By making sure that we make effective choices about which chart types are in our reports, like for example, advanced chart types for the right use cases, by making sure that these charts are transparent in the analytics and logic. For example, if we do predictive analytics, to make sure that we disclose all the appropriate metrics or to label them appropriately, and to avoid the trap of data heroism, to instead invest in the data skills of other people to try to improve the overall sustainability of how we work with data. Because the time of data heroes is over. With data availability, data literacy, and data culture, we have a new hope for a data-driven business. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you as well for having me. I hope you found this interesting. If you are interested, I have other talks as well about data visualization and adoption, which you can check out on my blog. And you can feel free to contact me on Twitter if you have other questions outside of this context.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kurt. Absolutely riveting session there. And really love some of the topics that you pulled out from data literacy. We do have a couple of questions coming in. So the first question is how to introduce users to new ways of thinking in visual data as opposed to tabular data.
Very, very, very good question. It's never easy and it's always different. Generally, what I try to do is to do it slowly and to not do it in a confronting way. Often it can be as simple as incremental changes to a report, adding more formatting, adding a small visual. What I find to be very effective is if you have a more tabular report, that you use a scatter plot, for example, that's beside it. For example, if you have a report that's looking at sales versus budget, and then you have a scatter plot which shows all the customer accounts and the delta, and then you show them, hey, if you see this one dot that's way apart from the rest, that dot, maybe that's interesting, and you click on that dot and the table immediately filters with cross-filtering, and that speaks for itself. And then over time, you can add more of these kind of things, really focusing on the actions, really focusing on the value, and it will just speak for itself. What you can also do is just provide various exposure, showing different ways. But those are often methods that I try to use. Discussing with users it a lot is important in that context.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Our next question comes in from Soti, and he asks, how often is a good idea to have those data cafes to get engagement? Weekly, maybe monthly?
What I usually recommend is to start off with it being weekly, especially if you find that engagement is extremely high. If engagement is low, then it's better to start off monthly, of course. You want to try to get as much initial buy-in as possible. If you can get an executive, like an executive sponsor of Power BI, to endorse it and encourage people to attend, that's fantastic really early on. And then once you have that big audience, to really make sure that you make a strong first impression, plan a good agenda, hear out people's feedback, make sure you don't get defensive. If someone just really starts expressing a lot of even resentment or negative feedback about a report, just give them a podium for a while to express and try to understand, appreciate their feedback, and then take it from there. So to summarize, weekly if engagement is high, monthly if it's not, and then keep it up monthly.
Excellent, thank you. And what looks to be our final question for today, how did you track data literacy as a KPI in your organization?
Tracking data literacy is always a bit of a challenging thing. What I like to do is I try to start passively by looking at the different ways that people are engaging with the report through the activity logs and the usage to see, for example, like what is the user saturation? So of the total users who have access to the report, what percentage of them are actually using it? What is the proportion of users who are using the reports versus exporting? So how frequent is export? Those are good kind of side indicators. And then if people are open to it, if you have enough responses, to have little small surveys to be able to query on certain data related topics. And there's a number of these kind of surveys that you can find online, a number of also NGOs and organizations which provide them. So you can usually pick a few questions from there and then distribute it to people so that they can answer it. But you have to make sure that you get enough answers to be able to make relevant conclusions from it.
Excellent point there, Kurt, as well. And I do want to say thank you again, just briefly before I do. For all of our participants, I've just put into the Q&A a feedback form. Now, this is a feedback on our wider webinars as opposed to just today's session to allow us to continue to bring you riveting content and topics that you want to hear about in the future. Now, Kurt, thank you very much again for today's session. Very well paced and very thorough in terms of the way that you've delivered it. And obviously, absolutely love the topic and theme of today's session as well, and what is such a what I would call a prominent point in the industry, but one that's not discussed very often at the moment. Yeah.
Also in society, I think, as we all saw during the COVID, we were all exposed to exponential graphs and rolling sums a lot more frequently. So in society, it's becoming a more and more frequent and important to be able to address this as well.
I couldn't agree more, and we look forward to having you back with us in the future as well. And as well, thank you to all of our participants for joining us today. This event was brought to you in association with our sponsors, Onyx Data, and do join us again next week, where we'll be back with another fantastic session to come together as a community to learn more. With that being said, stay safe, and as always, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you've been here with us at the Microsoft Power BI UK User Group. Take care now. Bye-bye.